Peter Meijer, welcome to the Dispatch podcast. And let's get right into the meat of this indictment. And maybe I should say, let's get a little bit of your background and your sort of expertise on this. You've been on both sides of the intelligence gathering kind of conversation, both as an Army intelligence officer and as an elected official. When you were in the House, you served on committees dealing with intelligence and classified information and Homeland Security. So when we look at the meat of this indictment of Donald Trump, it presents a lot of evidence that the former president, handled classified information not only without authorization, but sort of in this haphazard and careless way. Again, that's what the government's case is. So I'm curious, sort of first, of what your thoughts were about these kind of prosaic details, the kind of everyday details about how these documents were handled while in Trump's possession. Were you as shocked as I was at the way he handled them?
I mean, certainly what the indictment lays out does not make any case that these documents were handled with care or in any type of secure manner. I mean, it seems like a pretty shambolic move out process and storage process. And again, I think it's important to remember that most presidents, basically every other president in recent history, when that president has left the Oval Office, they've had some type of a library or other facility that the documents have been transferred to. And in Trump's case, I mean, it just looks like he brought them all down to Mar-a-Lago and just kind of shoved them in whatever closet or spare room, whether I think some of the photos of a ballroom stage being used or what appears to have been a bathroom. So it definitely does not lend any confidence that this was done in an organized, secure, or kind of otherwise competent manner.
Yeah, and maybe we should take a step back on this, because I think for laymen like me, even just for regular Americans, when the process with which classified information is shared with elected officials, with government officials, executive branch officials who need the information, whether it's digital, physical form, it's kind of a mystery to us. I mean, maybe you could speak to your experience about, again, those prosaic details. How are classified documents like these supposed to be handled? Is stuff printed off and handed to you in a folder in a SCIF and then taken away by that same? I think a lot of people don't even know how this could have happened, given the way that we kind of have this idea of how classified information is shared.
Yeah, I think it's first and foremost, I mean, you have several different layers of what is called classified. And my favorite thing to point out is technically unclassified is a classification. So an unclassified document is classified as unclassified. But so you go from unclassified and you have kind of that core designation, which can be unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret. And then you have all of the designations that follow. So it'd be kind of / no foreign for something that cannot be shared with any foreign country. You might have 5 Eyes, something that can be circulated within the 5 Eyes, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. You might have a designation that specifies human for human intelligence, something gathered from a human source. And then plenty of other kind of code word special access programs that would signify that a smaller number of individuals can have access to that information, and they have to be read on to that special access program or SAP. They have to be read on and read off of that. So that's, when we're talking about really incredibly damaging classified information, that's almost always going to be top secret, and it's almost always going to be something that's part of a special access program. Now, just from a broad brush standpoint, I had a security clearance my entire time in the military. I was in military intelligence. It took me a very long time before I saw something that was classified that was truly a shock to me or something that I didn't know. Many times classified information may just have a bit more granularity or a bit more detail. And the concern of that information getting out is not so much, the generalized contents as particular details that may either reveal a capability in terms of our intelligence gathering. So if you remember, there was a satellite photo of an Iranian rocket that had blown up on the launch pad that the Trump administration declassified. Now that showed a degree of kind of resolution that came, not necessarily as a surprise, because I think the assumption is always that our military and intelligence community has capabilities beyond, what the civilian sector may have. But it did show resolution that we hadn't seen before. And so that's one example of why something may be classified, even if Google Maps may be able to take a similar photo, or some of the Maxar, some of the civilian satellite companies may be able to show that same area. It could be a question of resolution. Ditto when it comes to something that may otherwise be reported in the New York Times or in open source media, but knowing how or the small details that may not seem like a lot to somebody who doesn't know the situation well, but if our adversaries were to get a hold of that, they could be able to pinpoint, okay, only 4 or 5 people knew this, seemingly trivial detail, but that helps, an adversary understand, who might have been the source of that information, potentially a recruited agent or somebody else. So I just wanted to give that example first. When it comes to those types of information and how they're usually stored or how they're transmitted, you have both physical hard copies. And if those are in an unsecure environment, so say an intelligence official is briefing members of Congress on Capitol Hill, they will bring that in a locked bag, so from a secure location to another secure location. It will be briefed within a SCIF, a secure compartmented information facility. And those are special rooms that are regularly sweeped for any listening devices. No one's allowed to bring cell phones or other electronic devices in there. And the intent is that information does not leave that room because anywhere else it could be overseen, overheard, or otherwise left insecure. Now it's a little bit different for senior or the entirety of some buildings could be classified as a SCIF. If many parts of the intelligence community, if you have a cell phone, you have to check that at the door. There may be additional redundant, places that are more secure than even the secure building.
Skiffier than the SCIF building.
Exactly. But oftentimes within the White House or within other places where information is shared regularly or discussions are taking place regularly, where, again, it may not necessarily be the specific content. It could also be you're discussing strategies that you don't want an adversary to know. And I think this is also kind of what gets into some of the differences between the Clinton email scandal and what we're talking about with Donald Trump. So there's a couple of different layers there, both the need to secure conversations, discussions, things that may result in strategy, things we don't want our adversaries to know about. There is the question of our analysis. So not necessarily kind of the consumers of that information and the policymakers. There's the analysis coming from the folks who are producing that information in the intelligence community. And then there's the question of the sources and capabilities, that really is the most important, because even though, if our adversaries know our strategy, they can preempt us. If our adversaries understand our analysis, they know what we're thinking. But if our adversaries are able to get to what our sources and methods are, then they can more effectively block our understanding and our future capabilities down the line.
And that's really what's, as you're saying, the most sensitive of that information. Well, what you've described doesn't sound like the situation as we can imagine, and has been somewhat pieced together by the government and by the Department of Justice. What happened and what was happening at Mar-a-Lago? I mean, Mar-a-Lago does not have any, there's no proof that it was not a SCIF. It was not a secure location. People were coming in and out. I think that is something that maybe intellectually we can kind of understand, but you've put a little meat on the bones here of sort of like what actually happens with these documents when they are secured properly and shared with officials. You mentioned the Hillary Clinton issue with her homebrew server. It's not really the only high-level elected official classified information issue that we have dealt with in the past few years. We, of course, have former Vice President Mike Pence was discovered to have had some classified documents that he had retained. He cooperated with the government when that was discovered. He was essentially cleared of any wrongdoing. And then, of course, President Joe Biden, from his time as vice president, there is an investigation going on right now into retention of some classified documents. So all kind of different situations. Maybe first you could talk us through a little bit of what makes all of these situations different, but I'd also be curious if you see any through lines in all of these very different situations, from Donald Trump's really kind of apparent egregious, handling of classified information, all the way down the list.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what I said earlier about it took me many, many years to read a classified document that actually came as a surprise. Where that information was, where it wasn't until I was in a unit that was supporting an elite special operations force that I read something and thought, oh, I did not know that. I had not read that in the New York Times. That is something that most Americans are not familiar with. The vast majority of things that are classified are incredibly routine, incredibly quotidian. And I think this is what I want to get to, discussing the differences between, Vice President Pence, President Biden's the documents from when he was vice president, and then also, President Trump versus Secretary Clinton. The first thing that I think is important to differentiate is that with Secretary Clinton, those documents were in a digital form. You mentioned kind of a homebrew server. Now, my understanding is that the majority of the items there that would have been considered classified, had to do with travel schedules, had to do with communications, the secretary's thoughts, things that if it were put down in a memo would probably be considered classified, but more because of the key stakeholder thought process and kind of strategy and insight that if that were to get out could be revealed. I think there were I think it was less than 10 documents that were attachments, that were classified. So intelligence products or otherwise something that had been put through. And it's important to know, especially when it comes to the State Department, they are technically a member of the intelligence community. There's an intelligence analysis bureau within the State Department, but most of that is not going to be, they're not recruiting and running sources, right? They may glean, and there may be information gleaned in those analytical products coming from CIA, which may get into human sources, or the NSA, which can get into signals intelligence and our capacity, but by and large, I think that was a case of, the convenience of using kind of off the shelf civilian, especially IT technology, which is not in any way, shape, or form rare throughout the government, right? This is a frustration that I think you see, especially within the military and especially within Guard and Reserve units, where oftentimes otherwise, sensitive information is going to be transmitted on open source or kind of civilian technology, simply because you can't go. Well, if you're a reservist, the closest skiff could be over 100 miles away, and if you just need to get information on, hey, FYI, you need to be at this place at this time, it is not feasible. It is not practical. Ditto if you have an executive official who may be frequently traveling and in the secure networks that they would otherwise be using, may not be accessible or may experience, IT issues. I mean, government IT can be incredibly competent in some unique circumstances. By and large, massive headache, massive hassle. And so then you have the workarounds, which were not necessarily intended, I think, to make the most charitable case, not intended to create a less secure environment, but just because of the reality of a situation, you may need to use something that's good enough, even if it doesn't necessarily meet the standards that are expected. And this has been the case. There was a Marine Corps officer in Afghanistan who was knocked down in rank and kind of filed a whistleblower request because he had information that they wanted to share with a partnered unit about a potential IED location. Now, that could have been something derived from a local source, is otherwise something that would be considered classified to protect that source. Using discretion, and this is that individual obviously got in trouble for this, but the challenge was, okay, we can have this information, but in between having the information and doing something with it, which is usually the point of collecting, you need to figure out, it's not always a perfect chain, right? I was trained as a foreign disclosure officer. There are certain steps and protocols. That is also rarely a perfect circumstance. And so, when the guidelines in the guidebook meet reality, it can be very messy. So that's Secretary Clinton. I think when it comes to Vice President Pence and President Biden, and also in the case of President Trump, I think one of the things that I am always a bit skeptical on is, you can discuss in broad brush what the information was, right? So we know that some of the information that they found down in Mar-a-Lago that President Trump had allegedly refused to hand back over, had to deal with nuclear capabilities, war plans, and other things that sound incredibly sensitive and may very well have been. But again, it's that question of the granularity and the question of those details. If it, you could have a document, and I think this may have been the case with Vice President Pence. You're going back through, and it's a travel schedule around, a senior official's foreign visit. That is going to be considered classified, right? Now, if that is leaked prior to that happening, that can cause severe risks and security breaches. But essentially, once that trip occurs, if that document got out in the public, the risk is probably pretty minimal. Maybe after the fact, or adversaries understand what type of hotel somebody wants to stay at. But otherwise, that is not a massive breach in the way that if it was released prior. So it's hard to know when they say that this classified document was found. Again, was that a menu for a dinner, that had secret no foreign up at the top, or is that something that would continue to pose a threat even today if it was released? Again, getting into capabilities that our adversaries don't know that we have, or getting into, specific details gleaned from a source where if that was disclosed, that human source could be put at risk.
Right. Right. As you're describing this, I'm thinking of the sort of arguments that, partisans sort of bring up whenever somebody on their side is embroiled in some kind of scandal, which is, and so I've heard it from both sides, right? We have an overclassification problem. We have a problem where, there's too much that's considered classified. To your point, information that, for lack of a better term, isn't really actionable, but after a certain fact, or past a certain point in time, by adversaries, by people who would do us harm. What are your thoughts on that? Is that really what we're what a big problem in terms of classification is? There's overclassification. Is it more subtle than that? Is it about trying to declassify things after the fact, information after the fact? Where do you see the problem, the areas for reform?
Yeah, no, again, looking specifically at the case of the documents that President Trump had, I have a real sense of skepticism at just being told vague parameters after the fact. Like I want, and this is also the tension, right? Like to form a judgment, I want to actually see what those documents are, because there have been plenty of times where the Department of Justice, and we've seen this with books that a former official may want to publish, where things will be blacked out or otherwise, censored, that you look back and say, are you kidding me? Like that was worth, kind of this back and forth. So there's certainly an overclassification. And this gets into a real tension, because if you then have a massive overclassification of information, right, in order to get access, you keep putting up bigger and bigger hurdles, but then you inherently need to expand the number of people who have access to that, right? We saw with this Air National Guardsman, Teixeira, in, I believe it was Massachusetts, right? I mean, this was an IT guy, who on the weekends when he was alone was going through all sorts of documents that didn't pertain to his job or role in any way, shape, or form. And his superiors saw it, counseled him time and time again, didn't stop the kid from doing it.
This was for listeners. This was the young Air National Guardsman who was sharing information on a Discord, on an online chat with teenagers, essentially, he was not much older than a teenager himself, and of course was caught and is facing now the consequences. Go ahead, Peter.
But that becomes a little bit of the problem when there's such a risk aversion to having even otherwise mundane information shared that everything gets walled off, but you need to make those walls so big that you have people within those walls who really shouldn't be there. So I mean, it's a very difficult place to find the right area to land, but I think there's no question that we have overclassification, and you can put that into a couple of different categories. I mean, one, information being classified that's otherwise in the public domain, otherwise widely known, but maybe there's a fear that if the government were to confirm in their own analysis what is already being talked about by foreign policy scholars in a university paper, that may lend credibility that. I mean, again, you get into these can kind of tendrils going out into oblivion. But then we also have the issue of information being classified in order to avoid scrutiny or public judgment, or to hide otherwise embarrassing or non-flattering details from the public. And I think that's something that worries me very deeply. And I think it's something that also creates an aura and a mystique around classified information that both undermines confidence in our government and gives root and kind of fertilizes conspiracy theories and other beliefs. Whenever I talk to somebody who holds conspiratorial beliefs about what they think the government is doing, I strongly encourage them, especially if they're young, join the government, right? See what these institutions are actually like. I would be my esteem of our government would go up 10 or 20 fold if they were actually capable of doing 1/10 of the things that you think from the outside they might be able to do. But this sort of allure and mystique with so much that is being classified, this document is top secret. Well, yeah, it could be something that if revealed would pose severe threat to our national security, and in secret poses danger if it's revealed. Top secret, it's exceptional, grave danger. I think only 1 out of 1,000 top secret documents that I've seen actually surprised me or shocked me or taught me something that I didn't know. And even in the case of that example I gave earlier, I think that was in the New York Times 2 years later. It had been disclosed. So not exactly, aliens at Area 51.
Well, but you make the point, Peter, that it's hard to judge when we're talking specifically about the documents that Trump had at Mar-a-Lago. It's hard to judge unless we know exactly what was in them. And again, let's separate out the obstruction charges, which strike me as more serious. I mean, he was essentially asked in good faith to return documents that he was not authorized to have, no longer as president, and
allegedly acknowledged that he. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, but do you believe that? I guess it's hard to judge these things, but the sort of cavalier way that he's alleged to have been discussing this information, in addition to reports. I mean, we know there was a Chinese national who was a spy who was at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, the sort of the I keep coming back to the process by which information you can argue, you can debate, and I think you make some great points about the level, what is in behind that wall, but the actual process of how this information, however correct it is that it's behind the wall, that should be respected, right? I mean, that seems to be what is egregious about the underlying alleged crimes in this indictment, that it was the cavalier way in which he was sort of sharing this information or allowing it to be, exposed. I'm curious, sort of, again, what your thoughts are specifically, knowing what we know and don't know about what was in these documents. Is the underlying crime being alleged a real problem for the former president?
Yeah, I think to your point on the obstruction and on the knowledge, again, going off the indictment and the allegations therein, it was not, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I had this. Here you go. Right. And I think that's probably the distinction between this case and the cases of President Biden when he was vice president and Vice President Pence, is in both of those cases, hey, let's go back through, fine tooth comb, double check. These we found these documents, here you go, as opposed to, it seems there was an intent very clearly stated by President Trump to not return these documents, even when after multiple iterations. So I think that is definitely a distinction. Now, on the security standpoint, there's something a bit paradoxical if we're now comparing Secretary Clinton and the server with President Trump. In some ways, yes, this was it was a private facility, but not necessarily, somebody's residence or where there was a small circle of individuals who may have had access. But they were documents that were physical copies. So somebody, in order to access those, again, not the individuals where, President Trump may have been bragging or sharing with, somebody personally, I think the larger concern is, to your point, with the Chinese national, other individuals who may have had access to the grounds, had they been able to get into the rooms where the boxes were stored, had they rifled through those boxes and found something interesting, right? That's a lot of steps to take. That's a lot of time to, spread papers out. And it does require physical presence. With Secretary Clinton, you could have had somebody hacking that remotely, a foreign adversary. That's a lot lower threat to them. And frankly, a lot easier to accomplish. So in some ways, even though there was not that physical copy, there may have been, and again, this is where we get into the shades of gray, right? We can't do an apples to apples on what the underlying material was without having an unbiased, neutral source be able to judge the danger. And this, is what I think is just so perfect about all of this is, if you remember, President Biden, when, right after the Mar-a-Lago raid, talking about, nobody who mishandles classified documents like these should ever, just this kind of high and mighty. It's like, oh yeah, did you check your garage? Did you go through that too? Right. Now, that's not to say that all these cases are equal. As we've discussed, there are different elements and there are gradations here. But the point inherent in there being gradations is they're all kind of shades of gray. Again, with the exception of Trump refusing after the fact to that kind of obstruction component. In every other case, you're not able to look at it in a black and white way. It becomes, well, yeah, but that was worse because of X or this wasn't as bad because of Y. Not able to say what my guy did totally fine, above board, and you clearly violated in all of these different areas. And so I'm very sympathetic to those who look at this whole scenario and just hang their head at the shambolic, incompetency that has been revealed across the board. Now, some of that, as I was saying earlier, is because the rule book, if it's seeking perfection, it's always going to run up against reality, and you're always going to have instances where things are not as perfect. I was at the Kabul airport during the collapse, during that withdrawal. That was not a scenario where it's like, hey, we need to go into the skiff and have this conversation, right? When real world events are occurring, you need to be prioritizing actually getting something done and not running into a situation where you're letting, a kind of administrative bureaucratic process meant for normal times. You need to know when you throw the rule book out because events are overtaking it. But the reality is that so much of our national security state is not geared towards expediency. It's not geared towards mission fulfillment. It has its own bureaucratic largesse, and that, talking as a former policymaker, when I was a member of Congress, there were times, specifically around the Afghan Adjustment Act, where I would run up against a wall where somebody would say, and this is just on numbers of folks who were evacuated. Well, we can't discuss that, on this line. We can't get into that on this line. Okay, well, I'm not going to co-sponsor or be involved in this legislation until you are open and honest. In that case, it took me 6 months to get a SCIF briefing, to answer questions, and frankly, just to confirm things that I already knew through individuals outside of government, but folks who were aware of what had occurred. That took me 6 months, and only after the direct intervention of folks in the Oval Office, because they wanted to actually see movement on this issue. And so there's a similar layer here with, and I think an inherent problem, getting into policy solutions here, an inherent problem where the executive branch, doesn't have the power to declare war, right? Isn't assigning the budgets, but they are both collecting intelligence. They're analyzing the intelligence. They're making decisions based off of that intelligence. And then they're going to the legislative branch and saying, hey, kind of trust us on this. Or if you want evidence, here's the analysis that we did. And here's why we want you to support our strategy. There's very little ability for checks and balances on the congressional side of the House, because Congress is dependent on analytical products and intelligence collection occurring within the executive, and then essentially being asked to ratify that ex post.
Well, you've just now opened up a whole new sort of discussion. I think we may have to revisit it, just about those kind of struggles as maybe when you were in Congress. I know you talked a lot about this sort of the reassertion of Congress's ability to, they are the Article 1 branch. Real quickly, while I have you, put on your political hat a little bit here. I mean, you when you were in Congress, always talked a lot about the sort of necessary reforms. There's not a lot of political constituency for them. And one of the fears I have is that, intelligence and classification, it's just all partisan now anyway. And it's all sort of seen through the realm of, well, what about, why wasn't Hillary Clinton indicted? Or what about Trump and all these things? I mean, is there a political, or maybe talk about the political solution for solving some of these problems? Because Americans just, again, don't quite, I think, understand everything that we've been talking about, and maybe they shouldn't, but that's going to be the source of political solutions.
Yeah, I know, especially after the Teixeira Discord leak, there was a conversation in which followed after the initial Mar-a-Lago raid or kind of search, and then the disclosures that both Biden as vice president and Vice President Pence had classified documents, and so I believe that Senators Senator Mark Warner and
yes.
Senator Todd Young. I don't believe Elizabeth Warren has gotten.
It doesn't seem like it's in her bailiwick.
But obviously Senator Warner on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Young, I'm not sure if he's on the Intelligence Committee, but he's a military veteran, very sharp. I think they had there's some bipartisan efforts to try to say, okay, how do we deal with all of these issues we're talking about, right? I mean, one, how the perfect process butts up against operational realities, and then also the overclassification, the challenges of declassification, and finding that happy medium, especially in an era where so many more things are shifting online, that if you're just doing everything, and when I say online, I mean, we have our classified intelligence networks, a variety of those. How do you make sure that you are if everything is taking place inside of Fort Knox, you got a lot of people coming into Fort Knox, right? You need to appropriately scale that depending. And so I'm confident that there will be some forward motion there. Again, it's not an issue that's going to rise to the top that folks are going to campaign on, but it's just good hygiene. It's good governance. It's something that is important, so that we both avoid the mistakes and the errors that we've seen, that we've discussed here. But also, we need to build confidence in our allies, that we can protect the information they're sharing with us. And we need to be able to build confidence with those who want to give us information, that the information they give us at great peril to themselves, oftentimes, will be safeguarded and will be protected. This was one of the massive downsides of the Bradley Manning leaks back in 2010. Those leaks, and this was almost everything there was secret or confidential. The vast majority of which were operational reports that didn't necessarily get into risking sources or methods or anything else. Though there were some issues with some of the State Department cables that have been released and kind of confidential information in terms of private discussions, not necessarily recruited agents, but things that, again, could have put lives at risk for somebody just being frank and candid with one of our diplomatic officials. But the signal that sent was, the U.S. can't safeguard its information, so don't trust them with telling any secrets, right? If you have a friend who whenever they get drunk, they just blab about whatever you told them in confidence, guess what you're not going to do? Tell them anything in confidence, right? And so we as a nation need to work to rebuild some of that trust with those who either work alongside us or we may ask to work for us, because what may just be political fodder to one person could be a question of life or death to another.
Yeah. Well, Peter, I have to ask you, you're very animated about these issues, about this particular policy. You served one term in Congress. You lost renomination, and of course that seat ended up going to the Democratic challenger, Democratic candidate. Do you have any interest in getting back into elected politics? You told the Dispatch just a few months ago that you're not discounting any possibility of running. There's an open Senate seat in Michigan. There's a governor's race in 2026. I mean, what is your interest in particular in staying a part of this conversation and running again for office yourself?
Now, listen, I think it's important that we have serious and sober conversations, right? Details matter. They may not matter to a reflexive partisan, who just wants to weaponize whatever thing comes across the transom and kind of fit it into or shape it as a partisan weapon. But at the end of the day, I care about our institutions. I care about this country, and I care about making sure that we have serious and sober individuals who are able to set aside what may be, resist the temptation of that political weaponization, that partisan weaponization of a moment, right? Those are the conversations that we need to be having around issues of document classification rather than just reflexive attack or reflexive defense. So I both care about that and making sure that there are sober voices having these discussions. So I have nothing to announce here, and I will refer you to my prior statement.
So that's you. Are you still considering then potentially, or you're not? Let me again, the prior statement. You're not discounting any possibility.
I will refer you again to my prior statement, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for joining me on the Dispatch podcast. Thanks so much for your time, and let's continue this conversation because you've opened up a lot more conversations about intelligence classification and what the policy should be in the future.
Thank you. I look forward to it. Take care.
Thanks.